Together, we work as one for better LGBTIQ lives. Outright. Welcome, everybody, to Asia OutSummit. My name is Grace Poor, and I work at Outright as the Senior Advisor, Special Projects Asia. With me today are colleagues and friends from the Asia LGBTIQ Network on SOGIE and gender-based violence. And this is an LGBTIQ-led feminist and intersectional regional platform for expertise on gender-based violence in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Northeast Asia. So with me today, Eka Tan Lane, who is joining us from Indonesia, where she works at the Indonesian National Commission on Human Rights. Jean Chong joins us from Singapore and is co-founder of Sayoni Singapore, a queer women's organization. And Rituparna Bora, who joins us from Delhi, India, and is co-director of Nazaria, a queer feminist resource group. Please read the more detailed speaker bios on the OutSummit webpage. And I will provide a link in the chat for the Asia LGBTIQ network on SOGIE and gender-based violence so that you can get to know about the network. All of us on this panel have many years of activism in different movements to stop violence rooted in patriarchy, which includes violence against LGBTIQ people. So our panel will be a frank discussion on centering wellness for sustainability of activism, on preventing and protecting LGBTIQ people from gender-based violence. In 2021, Outright and the Asia LGBTIQ Network collaborated in a study that looked at mental health stresses for activists in Asia working on gender-based violence. And I will provide a link in the chat to this study so that you can have a look at the findings. So let's start off this conversation. Ritu, Eka, and Jean, could you please take 1 minute to share your definition of wellness and well-being in the context of your work as activists working on gender-based violence?
Yeah, thank you so much, Grace. And to start off immediately about well-being and wellness, because well-being is mostly seen as the absence of disease, but it's not. It is a combination of a person's physical, mental, emotional, and various social health factors. And health is intrinsically linked with gender-based violence. And well-being is also linked to being happy and satisfied in life. And it, in short, it means that how you feel about yourself and your life, but it's not about your life alone. You are only not responsible of your life. So it's about how the ecosystem treats you. It's about how the system treats you. It's about how the laws and the institution treats you. And if there's gender-based violence, then your mental well-being or your mental wellness can go haywire. And that's what mental well-being. And it's how it's linked to gender-based violence. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ritu. Jean?
I don't have such a comprehensive answer. My definition is self-preservation, and also I see mental health well-being as how to be an effective activist, because I've said this quite a lot of times without mental well-being and self-care. So the chances of us taking a lot of risky decisions or misjudge situation is very high. So immediately our risk profile goes up and our anxiety goes up. So that's why I see it as a survival thing. We have to do it.
Okay, so you're saying that wellness is necessary as part of making good decisions in the work that we do as activists, huh?
Yes.
Okay. Eka.
For health, we always define it from 3 aspects: physically, psychologically, and socially. The problem could be when we talk about social health, social wellness, this is very difficult to reach sometimes because of discrimination and stigmas to particularly minority groups. Regarding well-being, we have to feel that our lives are full, we have to feel happy, and our goals are met in our life. Then we feel that we are on track towards our activities and our objectives. That's what's all for me. Grace, thank you.
Thank you. So working under COVID-19 conditions must have been a tremendous challenge for all of you, especially as we have read all of the studies in many countries. There were spikes, increases in family violence and intimate partnership violence across the board, and also in LGBTIQ communities. And there were limited resources to deal with these crises faced by LGBTIQ people. So could you take 2 minutes each to highlight some of the very dramatic, stark challenges that you faced in your work during the pandemic and how these challenges impacted your mental health and well-being as activists? Ritu, you want to jump in?
Yes. So basically, COVID-19 was very difficult for us. I am going to talk like 1 minute about the community because the community was locked in the home. The community did not have access to resources and even simple things like, having to wear what they want to wear for trans persons, for example, being used dead names, or lesbian women were forced to marry during this time, forced to see grooms during this time. There was conversion therapy everywhere. There was corrective rape everywhere. For us as human rights defender, one of the things that we face is that, gender-based violence was not regarded as essential services. The services that we gave under gender-based violence was not regarded as essential services. Only services for COVID was regarded as essential services. I think that was a mental health stressor. The second was closing of borders, because Delhi is a state where various people from smaller towns and towns and B towns come. The closing of the borders made it very, very difficult for us to do rescues, and that put us a lot of burden. Thirdly was that our peer counseling, we ran a peer counseling helpline. Because of the community did not get enough support from home, we had to keep the peer counseling helpline on even on Saturdays and for more hours. That actually increased a lot of our burden, and the cases also increased during that time. The helpline calls also increased, almost doubled during COVID. I think these are some of the mental health stressors that we as activists faced.
Okay, Eka?
Yeah, during the pandemic, we went through a Zoom fatigue because Zoom was not only during work hours, but also outside of work hours. Also, another worry was that for a number of stakeholders, particularly those who are from the government, they didn't want to work online. So we had to do these activities offline, where we ourselves were worried that we would get COVID-19. Also, we worried about during work in that time. I was finishing up my work as my master's studies, and then my parents were far from me, so I had to think about them every day. And this all added up to create a lot of stress and those kind of worries, and rather people dying and things like that. That went on for several months, so that it was very difficult for me to sleep, including until I became sick from that. And that's the kind of things that we experienced during the pandemic.
Oh, Grace disappeared. Maybe I can answer next.
Yes.
I'll take over. Just kidding. Well, I'll talk about Singapore. So when COVID was happening, oh, you came back. So
Sorry, I had somebody at the door. Oh my goodness.
We're like, oh, maybe it's time for us to run while the cat is away. Well, it's my turn to share. I was just talking about when COVID was happening in Singapore. I think a lot of LGBT groups were responding in a way that only they took care of their own constituency. So the different identity groups only kind of just trying to roll out assistance to their own group. So, but our response was the very first thing we did was to do a rapid survey of the community to see the entire community, what are some of the challenges they face. So one of the key things about gender-based violence is that we found 60 to 70% of the respondents talk about being stuck at home with their abusers, which is very often our families. So about 60 to 70%, and because they're locked in, they couldn't escape. So after we got the statistics, the very next thing we start to fundraise so we could take care of the entire LGBT community, including residents in Singapore, because we have a huge population of people that are not Singaporeans. They are also stuck here as well. So we want to take an intersectional approach to take care of them. We provided 8 months of COVID relief over 5 times actually, which provided counseling, support group, cash vouchers, food vouchers, and so on and so forth. So it ran for a long time. But the big question for us when I was running it for 8 months during COVID, we took care of others, but who takes care of us, right? It's about self-care question. So, but in that 8 months, it was like having a full-time job. We not only have to deal with meeting up people because of the health risks. There was no vaccines that time, so there's an element of the risk. The second thing that we had to deal with was abuse. Actually, people who did not get the support from us because we only have so much money and we have to choose the most people that are the most affected, and we get abused by people who didn't get it. And very often the people who abuse us are cisgendered gay men. So I just want to call that out. And they are the main abusers. And a lot of times they do have a job, just that their salaries are very much reduced. So, so the other thing that I often talk about is how COVID amplifies some of our existing issues in the community. We found that the different identity groups respond to help quite differently. Very often, gay men they are more comfortable applying for support. Then the lesbians, the trans men, and trans women often do not respond the way that the rest did, and as well as elderly people, they don't have computers, and we had to change the way we reach out to them by word of mouth, through their own community groups, because they don't have laptops, right? They have handphones. So, and very often they told us that having the COVID relief was a relief for them. They're happy to have it because before COVID, there was nothing for them. So the existing problem is way deeper than what COVID created. So what happens when the relief is gone? So that's the other layer of stresses that we face.
Thanks, Jean. Yes, so COVID exacerbated and really threw up for everybody, for the world to see how not only things were during COVID, but pre-COVID. So that's an excellent point. Thanks for bringing that up. So in the study that I mentioned earlier that Outright and the network collaborated on, participating activists, and you all participated, all of you participated in that study with 27 other activists from 6 countries were participating in that study. So the people who took part in the study said that those who were working under conservative governments, they felt that a significant contributing factor for mental health stresses for activists was that they themselves had to deal with the stigma and marginalization that which was the same as the people that they were trying to help. They also said that, some of them also said that they face hostilities when they were intervening in violence against LGBTIQ people. So, and while they were dealing with traumatic, difficult cases, hostile reactions from people like parents who felt that this was a private family matter and they didn't want activists to be interfering in this private family matter, even though there was so much violence against the member of the family. So while activists are going through all of that, at the same time, participants in the study said that they worked for organizations with limited resources who could not provide mental health supports to their staff. So there was no space to process traumatic cases. There was no space for LGBTIQ people to deal with what they were facing because of transphobia and homophobia. Sometimes they were out in their organization, sometimes they were not out in the organization. So there was this difficulty that they were dealing with without support. So the question that I have for you is, did you come across this in your own work? And how did you deal with it? What help was available to you, for instance, when you had to deal with these kinds of situations? Please limit your responses, if you can, to 3 minutes.
Yes, yes. So I identify myself as an indigenous person, woman with disability. And when I first came into the queer movement, let alone the conservative government, when I first came into the queer movement, I was seen as the other. To come to the mainland, it becomes very difficult. So I'm seen as the other, and Delhi is seen as the mainland. So the entire queer movement found it difficult to have a leader who is indigenous and who does not speak the English the way they do. You know, it was actually it is still upper class and upper caste. In terms of conservative governments, parents and conservative governments are always come together. So in our rescue operations, police have no say in matters where we decide, where we go by the law and rescue, LGBT people. So in cases where we have rescued LGBT people, parents have filed, cases, criminal cases against us. We have been where we had to go to the court, and we still don't know what is the status of our criminal cases in one state, because that state police refused to come to before the High Court of Delhi. There are cases where, because of lack of shelter homes, I have myself kept people at my home during the interim period where we were waiting for the judgments to come. My parents have come and destroyed properties at our homes, and the police says, why will the parents think bad about the children? You should let the child go back to the parents, and we have to constantly say that they're adults, they're above 18 and they can take decisions, and it's a constitutional right. We always go by the constitutional right. And what happens is that because of conservative government, we do not have good laws, protecting LGBTQI people. Therefore, the police also have a say. Sometimes we have good laws, but the police also supports the parents' attitudes and the government attitudes against LGBTQI people, and it becomes very difficult for people like us who are human rights defenders and supporting the community and who are queer persons themselves. So, and because they say that because you are like this, therefore you are making our daughters like this, they have called us witches. They have called us, I don't know what names, I can't even tell you. But this is what happens.
Thank you, Ritu. Eka?
The conservative government in Indonesia has many apparatus that we don't have laws that differentiate majority and minority groups based on anything, but nevertheless, the goals of policies are not fulfilled by what the government does. In fact, they have policies that are discriminative. Then I am a part of the community. So when I do advocacy, that we can imagine as a very difficult situation for any minority group, but they don't know my identity. And if they want to find out my identity, sometimes it's going to be dangerous. And they have jokes full of lots of stigma and discrimination. I have to listen to those things. And I just have to smile and have to go along with that. But when I'm very push back on that too much, it won't be good for what I'm trying to advocate for. And so we can't do this using confrontational, but using an approach that is very careful and cautious. That takes a lot of time. So even though our work does not guarantee the human rights of all people, including LGBTIQ people, these discriminations that we go through are not only against us personally, but against our work. And so we have a number of friends who have been doing this kind of human rights advocacy much before I started, and they have worked with human rights victims of other groups outside from LGBTQ groups. We see, what do these people do? They commit discrimination against the victims that they're supposed to be working for. And so when I see that, they say that, oh, they're never going to be open or out about their identity. It's not fair. But they say that by doing that, they can still give their contributions to the communities that they're trying to help without having to be totally open about their own identity. And so that kind of suffering does not caused only by themselves, but by their religious groups, and also caused by their work that they do on behalf of the LGBTQ community. And so they come from a very strong religious background. This can, even though they're working to help LGBTQ people, they can undergo different problems, particularly with their own families.
Great,
and so it's not only the government, but it's even opening up my identity to even my own colleagues. It can be an obstacle for my work for the human rights of others.
Right, and makes you vulnerable. Yeah. Jean?
I was thinking about how to describe Singapore. I think there's a lot of misconception about the country I come from. A lot of times when context is important. When people look at Singapore, they use a development lens. They're like, how can you not have human rights? How can you not have resources to organize? But the reality is that the government is conservative, and that we have lots of restrictive laws. So in this kind of context, in dilemma, how do we work to change policies, especially when it comes to gender-based violence? I think amongst many activists, we often talk about how we are under stresses from vertical attacks, which is from the government, and horizontal attacks, which is from your peers. So for an example, is like from us, we work with the government to change domestic violence laws, to draft up the recommendations to be gender neutral, meaning that gender is not incorporated into the legal language. But in the process of trying to work with the government to change these laws, we also face attacks from peers, from other civil society activists, like, why are we working with this government who has violated so many human rights of people who live here? So, but the question for us is that, can LGBT people facing domestic violence wait? What is do we wait for a perfect government? before we try to change the laws. And what is the context of the political system in Singapore? We might not have any dual political diversity for the next 40, 50 years. So that kind of pressure and not understanding from other activists also created a lot of mental health pressures on us. A good example is that my volunteers and my staff would quit because they felt so deeply hurt and traumatized by the attacks from your peers that they feel like, what is the point? It's not worth it that I'm doing all this work, but yet I'm being criticized and attacked or call all kinds of names or using specific words to that can really hurt you. So so I think there's also a generational divide where I think a lot of younger activists saw their activism online, but the reality of policy negotiation is that you have to do it offline. And very often to reach the table takes work to study the policies, to write the recommendations. So Instagram activism is not equivalent to policy change. And I don't think I'm the only one saying this. Lots of activists have been talking about this phenomenon that we are all facing, and it's not healthy for the community. Yeah.
So I think the picture that I'm getting from what you all are saying, all of you, Ritu, Jean, and Eka, is that while you're in the fight, whether it is doing frontline responding, first responder activism, whether it's doing policy change work behind the scenes, or whether it is trying to navigate the tensions from within your own communities, whether it's your religious community or family, while doing this work, is that it places tremendous burdens on individual activists, organizations where individuals are working with the organizations. And I think that's one of the things that we want to do in this panel, is to look at how the wellness, the mental health, the mental well-being of activists working to prevent and protect people from violence is assaulted, compromised, takes tremendous inner resources to deal with these things when there are no existing mental health supports for individuals. So based on that, let me go to the next question, which is activists in Asia, particularly the folks in the studies, said that there is an expectation that activists must be selfless. That's what activism is. You have to be selfless. Always prioritize the work. Always prioritize the needs of the community over your own needs. Now, this makes it very difficult to claim time and space for self-care, right? Because self-care is somehow considered selfish. So my question for you is, how do you practice self-care? How do you navigate between these expectations of selfless activism and centering wellness in the context of the work that you work in? If you could just take about 2 minutes each, please. Thank you.
I can start. So for me, actually, it was difficult for me to take a break personally, and I am the greatest advocate of self-care. And it was difficult for me to take a break because, first of all, as a director, I was handling a lot of things, and also I felt that if I take a break, what will happen? Like, what if the organization crashes? So it was because of the policies that we have in our organizations, and also the colleagues that I work with are amazing. And also the culture that we have been managed to build. Now, when someone is on vacation or someone is on this thing, no one disturbs. So even if I try and talk to my colleague during vacation, like one of my colleagues, I tried to say that, did you work on this? And he said, you're on vacation, you just need to switch off your phone and just relax. That's what and he's very junior, and that's what he told, because the culture we've been able to build in our organization, it's a very small organization with very little funding. But this is actually what we do. We support each other. We have created buddy systems where, like people of similar hierarchies ask each other if they're okay, if they're hydrated enough. this is the first question people ask, are you hydrated enough? Because we feel that it's very important to take care of self. And even we have policies like bereavement leaves. Recently my dad passed away, and it was very difficult for me. And my entire staff, except, asking how am I doing, did not disturb me even for anything. The events were done without me being part of it. Collaborations were done without my senior activist, feminist activist gets very startled, like how a small organization could manage to do this, where they managed to do collaborations even without me being there, without me being taken decisions. So when I got many calls for support and crisis intervention, I just had to pass on a number of my colleagues who did not even disturb me for any crisis intervention work. So I think we have to constantly talk about self-care and how self-care is linked to collective care. Because if I did not have that collective care within the organization, I would not have managed to survive even this long, in the time of grief or in the time of COVID. But this is what we do in our organization. Thank you.
Eka and Jean, if you want to share your how, because I think it's important for us to know
Penting bagi
how,
kita untuk tahu
how you
bagaimana
do your self-care.
To be selfish. So that's my first response. But I really want to criticize this ethos of suffering amongst activists. We expect activists to suffer, and we often judge each other when we are taking care of ourselves. There's this judgment of why you're not suffering. Are you really an activist? And it happens a lot. So one thing that happened to me was many years ago when I decided to be a full-time activist. The very first thing I'm trying to make sure is that I got a mortgage and get my place. But immediately I see here activists making comments like, oh, you bought a place, a small place for yourself. Then I'm like, yes, because I'm trying not to be homeless. I know that activists don't get a lot of money. So I really struggle with guilt and shame for a while because they are shaming me because I'm not suffering enough like them. But I spent more than a decade in the corporate sector, so I have a little bit of savings. So I went to a self-care retreat. I'm sure some of you will know Lim Lam Chu, and I told her about it, this old feminist. I'm not sure whether she's lesbian, maybe. And she told me that we shouldn't let this expectation of suffering amongst activists to get to all of us, and we should keep practicing and questioning why do we want each of us to suffer. This is something that I feel like we need to keep calling it out. Yeah.
Eka?
Before working as a human rights educator, 3 years before, I worked at a corporation with the expectation that to work as a human rights educator, I work for my victims, for the community. I give my full there. I have a background and with my minority identities that makes me, I experience fatigue, I experience stress, and I have individual changes. From a very happy person, I become a very short-tempered because I become a different person. My energy is absorbed for the fight when I only think about the victims, with everything, the conservatism in Indonesia that I have to face. In 2019, I said, enough is enough. I have to do something for myself so I can still continue my work. So I took classes, and it's very specific in psychology. I very much want to study about what happened to myself. I did not go to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but I went to school to study about myself. And when I read a lot of scientific journals, there are many impacts when we help our brothers and sisters. We experience burnout, trauma, secondary trauma, and we also experience fatigue. And I feel I experienced this all myself. And I found an article in a journal. What is self-care and why is self-care important for activists? That article is written by Melinda Weinberg. She also did some study among other activists, and she discovered the same thing. There are many activists that who experience a change of personality because they do not take care of themselves. So finally, their energies are absorbed from different articles. I try to cure myself because younger students who learn psychology, it can be treated as outpatient therapy. So I decided that I have to take care of myself during the pandemic. This is a point for me. I started with meditation. I eat well, healthy. I start exercising, and this make me a different person. I know I discover my old self when I'm a happy person. If no, I'm a little bit burnt out. It shows me a little bit I'm chubby, so I have to increase my self-care. We need to do it so that we can help other people, other friends in the community.
Thank you for that, Eka. Jean, please jump in.
Oh, I think it's I was just thinking like a good analogy would be like if when we're all taking a plane, then there's always this announcement, or in case of emergency, the oxygen mask will drop. The very first thing they tell you is put the mask on yourself first before you can try to help other people. And I think that's so true when it comes to self-care. If you don't have oxygen, why be taking care of other people? So be totally selfish, take the oxygen, do your pedicure, put your pictures on Facebook, show it off to people. It's like, yeah, I'm being selfish so that I can run the long race.
Thank you, Jean. So since we have started talking about, taking care of self, Eka talked about reading journals, Ritu talked about self-care and the kind of support from within her organization that felt really gave confidence that work can continue even when she was unable to due to bereavement. And Jean talks about the kind of guilt and shaming that takes place, which may be inadvertent, but has tremendous impact on individual activists. So the question, I guess, now is, it is difficult to get psychosocial support. It is difficult to get mental health services for activists, particularly activists who are working on gender-based violence, because in my experience, right, many of the activists I know who are working on gender-based violence are themselves survivors. They're survivors of family violence, they're survivors of childhood sexual abuse, they're survivors of partner violence. So there are possibilities when they may be triggered in the work that they're doing. But it is very difficult to get mental health care, either because there is no LGBTIQ affirming mental health services, or even if there are counselors who are LGBTIQ affirmative, they're not affordable for individual activists, or the providers are located really far away, or maybe some mental health professionals have breached confidentiality and activists just don't feel safe going to them. So given some of these challenges and barriers to getting the kinds of support that we need, what do you think, how can alliances between mental health professionals and LGBTIQ activists working on gender-based violence be strengthened?
Yeah. So first of all, we need to destigmatize mental health, right? So as the director of an organization, when I came out as having mental illness, I have bipolar disorder, you know, I have CPTSD, things like that, where when I'm undergoing therapy, trauma-informed therapy on a regular basis. I take psychiatric medicine every day. So I openly talk about my mental illness to people, and within my organization and within this thing. So I feel that has also given us, support to my colleagues, to people I work with, to talk about mental wellness. So almost all my colleagues are taking mental health support. We have also been, one thing that I realized that after taking trauma-informed counseling, that queer affirmative practice is also important, but trauma-informed counseling is very important because all the queer people have faced some sort of trauma in their lives, and only queer affirmative therapy will not help if they are not trauma-informed. And this is what I have realized from my personal experience, and this is absolutely true. Because this is how it's helping me and other colleagues of mine. After I've started taking therapy, I also taking therapy, feeling confident about taking therapy. We also provide money, at the end of the year for anything they wish to do. And also we have counselors, we have mental health professionals who provide free counseling to LGBTQI people who cannot afford this thing, because it's very expensive. So we have been able to maintain that system for at least 3 to 4 years now, that we are providing free proper regular mental health counseling to LGBTQI clients, where we also provide things like listening circles, art-based therapy to also our residents of the safe homes, and also from the livelihood center. So we have been able to talk about mental health in a way, mental well-being in a way which is destigmatized. And we've been also able, through those two counselors, we've been also able to build network of counselors who are supportive of queer people. Yeah.
Thank you. We have 10 minutes. So, and we have one last question that I would like to ask so that we can wrap up our discussion. So Jean, talk a little bit about this.
My answer is a little bit different from Ritu. I mean, Singapore is a really small place. Personally, for my group, we've collected 60 LGBT-friendly therapists and counselors, but I don't go to any of them. There are two reasons. One is security issue. I don't feel safe sharing with any of these 60 persons because Singapore is a small place. I don't want any kind of data, information, or vulnerability of me to be out there. And secondly, like what Ritu say, a lot of counselors and therapists and social service trained, they very often they have absolutely no idea what they're talking about when it comes to LGBT gender-based violence. There's a huge lack of expertise. So whatever therapy session will just end up with me pointing out all the holes that they are talking about. So it doesn't work for me. So I think one of the solutions that me and some of the leaders or EDs in the Southeast Asia region is like we're starting to form a support group for people to support each other. So it doesn't have to be restricted in your country, with a facilitator or coach that has experience to facilitate this support group once every month, once every 2 weeks or once every month. Yeah.
Eka.
Yes. Here, we do have services for mental health that is friendly for our colleagues in LGBTQ community, including myself, but this is on a pay basis and is not provided by an agency. And this service is difficult for people to access from our community, but it's very important to have a kind of a container or a avenue where we can strengthen each other, where we can share our stories, where we can face the dynamic of the struggle for human rights that we're doing. Because like with Jean's experience, when I access this service that is friendly towards LGBT community, there's still a fear that the therapy that I use could be accessed by other people. And so it can be very difficult to access these kind of services and have to maybe choose to just tell my story to my friends, and I have to be very selective about the friend that I tell this to, because my friend circle has to be very small of people that I trust, that I can talk to. And even though that's very helpful for me, and this is something that's also experienced by my friends, that we also need an avenue to tell our stories to each other. And like Jean said, we have to create an avenue like that in Asia that crosses different countries. Thank you.
Now, listening to you all, I feel very emotional, actually. So thank you for being so candid. So to wrap up our discussion, let's do a lightning round of responses. And in 30 seconds, not 30 minutes, 30 seconds or less, here's the question for you. What would you recommend for self-care in activism to be a radical practice? Now, this is a whole workshop, it can take 2 hours, but in 30 seconds, what would you recommend in order for self-care in activism to be a radical practice?
Can I go first? I think, especially for LGBTQ individuals, self-care is we need to get rid of self-care is often linked to selflessness, because patriarchy requires us to be selfless and constantly giving. So we need to beat the patriarchy that frames the issue around selflessness and self-care. Very important.
For me, I think the radical practice, first of all, would be to just be okay to be vulnerable. The fact that we are all vulnerable, we can all make mistakes. I think this is the first thing, because we're all taught to be perfect. You know, this whole idea of I'm the perfect feminist, we are all not perfect. I think this is the first thing we need to understand. The second thing I would definitely talk about is collective care. You know, self-care without collective care is impossible. So these are the two things that I want to talk.
Eka?
I agree with Ritu that we are not perfect people, and we need to take the time to care for ourselves, because if we don't care for ourselves, we can't care for other people and help other people. And so that's why we really need to take care of our community and our other members of our community, so we can continue to do our advocacy.
Well, this prompts me to ask 2 follow-up questions. Well, actually make one comment. You know, Audre Lorde, who is a Black feminist, lesbian feminist, civil rights activist, who I respect a lot in her work and who she is and so on. Audre Lorde said, caring for myself is not self-indulgent, it is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. And I really believe that. But I want to pick up on what Ritu said about collective care. The concept of collective care, you know, developing mechanisms of collective care as an alternative to provide supports and for sustainability of activism. My question is, how do we ensure accountability so that no harm is committed?
Yeah. See, I come from an indigenous village where I have always seen collective and community care. I cannot imagine life without community care. So for instance, and self-care is sometimes easier. For instance, corporates would give, you know, money to people, say that go and take care of self. But collective care means overhauling the system. It means equal pay. It means respect. It means, you know, it means diversity and inclusion. It means so many policy changes. Therefore, collective care is not taken care of as important. And collective care sometimes is also not quantifiable. Self-care is like you have given 20 beauty passes to women, but collective care means actually challenging the entire system and taking care of the system. And if the system is actually, the policies are such that you are accountable, all of us are accountable, I think we would be able to make that change with collective care. It's not that difficult.
Okay, so on that note, let's go to the Q&A and see what we have. Let's see, are there any questions? I don't see any questions. So let me ask a question because I think it's important for us to address one thing that came up in your questions. Now, in India in 2018, Singapore in 2022, consensual same-sex relations was decriminalized. In Indonesia, as recently as December 6, there was passage of a revised criminal code that criminalizes extramarital sex and cohabiting couples, including same-sex couples, and a whole host of other things. So how have these kinds of changes, at the national level, how do they affect individual activists at the same time, at the national level, but also activists who are working to stop violence against LGBTIQ people? Because we know that in places where there is decriminalization, do we assume that violence goes down? And in places where there's now criminalization, do we assume that violence is going to go up? And how is that affecting activism?
We also have the Trans Act, Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act. I think the best thing with these laws is that we are able to go to the police and we are able to go to the judiciary and can say that, see, we have these rights and please implement these rights. So even if the families are against us, the police are against us, we can just take the constitutional route and the legal route and support each other. I think these laws and judgments are very, very useful for us.
Anybody else want to speak to this? Eka, you want to talk about the Indonesia situation?
The new criminal code divide the human rights and the conservative. This is a very struggle that is very tiring. We are very threatened by this. Not only those friends from the LGBTI, but also friends who fight for LGBTIQ. But this, we have to continue our struggle with whatever means that we have, by asking help, by consolidation. Currently, it is a regress in our struggle and for LGBTIQ, but we cannot give up. We have to do everything and we have to advocate for our struggle on one side. On the national level, there's an attempt to criminalize us, but there are also certain areas that can become more open and accept us. So we need to continue our struggle.
Jean, do you want to have the last word?
I think over the last year, when the repeal was happening, we were negotiating for it. So there's a lot of mental health stresses because it was a roller coaster ride with the backdoor negotiations. But now that it's been repealed, we can see that the religious groups are organizing for battle, and you can see them. I think that at the back of our minds, even though we're celebrating, but we're also watching what they're doing, and I think the road ahead will be tough for us as well.
I just want to make a note that, here we are in a professional setting, doing OutSummit, sharing, our thoughts, and Ritu's cat is there on screen as well. I love it because it's like talking about self-care talking about sustainability of activism, and we have our animal companions right there. You know, we're not in a corporate setting, or maybe even in a corporate setting. You know, why not have our dogs and cats with us? So time has flown, and I want to thank everybody. It's a privilege to know you. It's a real honor to hear about your work, and thank you for being so candid in what you have shared. We definitely, I think we definitely need to change the cultures of activism that deprioritize self-care. And secondly, funding is definitely needed for long-term support of mental health and well-being, so that individual, organizational, and movement wellness can be supported while we are striving to prevent and protect LGBTIQ people from gender-based violence. So on that note, thank you to everybody, all of you. I'm so glad that we'll continue to work together